Good morning, everybody. It's really good to see everybody here. We have a great program for you. Welcome back, NSFers. We're really happy to see everybody here today. We are starting our fall series on looking at the future of conflict around the world and what that means for the United States as we look at protecting our national security and understanding how our military and all of the entities that support our military are adjusting to essentially a new era of fighting wars in the age of AI. Should be an exciting period for us. We have some great programs coming to you starting today. What we've done today is a different kind of program. Normally, I have speakers and discussants. But because John is covering such a broad topic, and because I know for a fact that John is a tremendously engaging speaker, I've asked Dr. John Nagl from the U.S. Army War College, who specializes in great power conflicts, to give us the stage setter for what we should be thinking about as we look at conflicts in the very near future or current conflicts and what we can anticipate looking forward. I have to tell you that John's on the East Coast because he's at the U.S. Army War College, and he just told me that he just gave this talk at 5:30 his time to a group in Germany. So you are very lucky. Dr. Nagl, please take it away.
Thank you, Maureen. A couple of my students online from the Army War College, and I also do some adjuncting at George Washington. I think a couple of those folks are on as well. So looking for hard questions from them. I am speaking on my own behalf and not that of the Army War College, George Washington University, the United States Army, Department of Defense, the Department of War, or any of those organizations. And I'm going to talk to two separate topics, either of which would be plenty to keep us going. But let's go ahead and end slide, please, Maureen. The world is a mess right now, and I'm going to provide some folks who agree with this assessment, but just quickly, and perhaps obviously, the Russo-Ukrainian war continues. News on that in the last 24 hours. We should have great questions today. Israel continues to be engaged in a war against Hamas. Hezbollah is on the ropes. In a really interesting way, Iran continues to suffer. If there's one good news picture on this slide is that Iranian proxy forces have been dealt some very severe blows. I don't believe permanently, but we can talk to that. China, what we in the Department of the Army call our pacing challenge, a threat in the Pacific and the Philippine Sea, and in particular perhaps to Taiwan, and North Korea continues to have a rapidly growing nuclear arsenal. What's most worrying is not any of these challenges individually, but the fact that the four powers I've discussed, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, are colluding together in something that some of my friends call an axis of upheaval in a far more direct, much closer manner than the leadership of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan ever colluded during the Second World War. For the last 3 years, I've been running a bunch of the Army War College's work on the Ukraine war, seeking lessons learned from that ongoing conflict, the biggest conflict in Europe since the Second World War. These teams are composed of faculty members and students at the Army War College, most of them military, not all. Very proud that each of the years has included the Ukrainian student here at the War College. And I'm particularly proud of the chief of staff from the first year. That's the blonde woman standing at the far right as you look at the slide. That's Colonel Katie Crome. Katie left the Army War College right at 2 years ago after the first year of the project in 2023. She became the director of war plans in the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, did that for a year, and she is now the executive assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I am going to briefly cover what we've learned from each of the 3 years of the war to date. If you're interested in more, this is a book. It's free for download, published by the Army War College Press under my name and Katie's, titled The Call to Action, Lessons from Ukraine for the Future Force. The first chapter of the book is also a journal article, same title, A Call to Action, published in Parameters, the Journal of the Army War College. The authors there are Crome and Nagl. That article has 100,000 downloads. It is the most downloaded article in the history of the Army War College. which we completed in academic year 23. So in June of 23, we argued that just as 50 years earlier, the U.S. Army was at an inflection point, the same way it had been in 1973, coming out of 20 years of failed counterinsurgency campaigns in Asia and fighting proxy war. In 73, it was the Yom Kippur War, our ally Israel against a number of Arab countries. In 2023 and continuing to today, our Ukrainian friends against Russia, Ukraine backed up by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We saw rapid fundamental changes to the character of war, in particular, the application of artificial intelligence and unmanned systems in the air, at sea, and increasingly on the ground. We saw challenges to our strategic depth in both weapon systems and soldiers, believing that large-scale combat operations, what the Pentagon now calls big wars, in contrast with the counterinsurgency campaigns of the last 20 years, we could see casualties in 2 weeks that we saw in 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan put together. So we would project 10,000 dead, 50,000 wounded in a single war, either in Asia or in Europe, in Asia against China, in Europe against Russia. Significantly more. It wouldn't be additive if we were fighting both wars at once. And part of my message here is that we have to watch the collusion among those hostile powers. I don't believe we would fight either of them at once. I think they would both go together. And sustainment nodes, what we're calling contested logistics, the Pacific Ocean and conceivably the Atlantic Ocean as well would be contested in a way they haven't been since World War II. We would have to protect our sea lines of communications, and we don't have the Navy to do that right now. So that's all pretty concerning. That was what we argued from the first year of the war, published in the late summer of 2023. I'm very proud of the way that study has stood up. That's one of the reasons it has so many downloads. All of those arguments, I think, are now common wisdom, perceived wisdom. They were not so when we first published them right at 2 years ago. If the first year of the Russo-Ukrainian War looked like World War II, with lines on the map changing pretty dramatically, looked like World War II tank maneuvers, the second year of the war and the subsequent years of the war have looked more like World War I. And so we called the second year's book A Long, Hard Year, Russo-Ukrainian War Lessons Learned for calendar 2023. That was done by the class of 24 at the War College. That book should be out any day. We looked at trench warfare and what that meant, the increased importance of artillery. The American military prior to the war in Ukraine was moving toward precision fires rather than mass fires, missiles rather than artillery. There is a place for both of those in war, and we've dramatically increased our production of, for instance, 155 millimeter artillery shells. The casings for those are built in Scranton Army Ammunition Plant. And we take a trip there every year with the Army War College students to help them understand the industrial muscle that is required to fight and win modern wars. One of the big questions about the Russo-Ukrainian war is air power. People have made the argument that this is just two not very good armies fighting each other. I believe that those two armies have gotten progressively better over time, but neither of them is fighting with an air force that has anything like the capabilities of the United States Air Force. Instead, they are fighting a drone war and are now the best in the world at drones. And we have a lot of lessons to learn, in particular from the Ukrainians. The strategic center of gravity for Ukraine continues to be NATO and US support. And we saw an expression of that yesterday in what appears to be a change in US policy over the last, for calendar 2025, the third year of the war. Drones, artificial intelligence, what that means across multiple domains, including the space domain, which we can talk to if you're interested, and the air domain, which I've already talked to. MDO is multi-domain operations. That's the current U.S. Army warfighting doctrine, enabled by, empowered by not just air, but also the cyber and the space domains. And we argued our study from the third year of the war that we believe the fighting is likely to continue for additional years to come. A statement supported by Secretary of State National Security Advisor Marco Rubio yesterday. I'm now going to go bigger than the war in Ukraine, as if the war in Ukraine wasn't a big enough topic for us, the biggest war in Europe since 1945. But it's actually bigger than that. Historians today increasingly believe that World War II began not in 1938, but in 1931 with Japan's invasion of Manchuria. You obviously couldn't know in 31 what was going to happen over the next 15 years. But smart people like George Will are suggesting that we are already seeing the opening phases of World War III. And I found this quote interesting from George when I read it a little more than a year ago, but it didn't cause me to do anything until a week later. I saw House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Mike McCall from Texas say a very similar thing on the record. Chairman McCall was asked, what keeps you up at night? And he said, quote, World War III, it would be an unholy alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, threatening both Europe and the Pacific. Chairman McCall is one of the most briefed people in the country. He gets the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, every day. House Foreign Affairs Committee is top 20 in the United States. Chairman McCall didn't come up with that himself. He is being briefed that by very high level people. And so that got my attention and caused me to keep taking note, in particular, over the summer of 2024 now, right at a year ago. And it got worse. Phil Zelikow, you may not know that name. I know Phil pretty well. Phil was the chairman of the 9/11 Commission. He was the lead pen on the 9/11 Commission report, perhaps the best government document of the last century. Terrific report. Can't commend it to you highly enough. Phil, in a piece in the Texas National Security Review, suggested that there's a serious possibility of worldwide warfare in the 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 range. And if you don't know Phil, that won't send a chill down your spine. But Phil is one of the most sober, least prone to exaggeration people I've ever met. He is a very careful man. He can do the math in his head. And so this scared me. And two other people I know well, Andrea Kendall Taylor and Richard Fontaine in Foreign Affairs a year ago. I'm not sure if they coined, they gave some credit for the term axis of upheaval. They say the shared coordination among China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia is brought together by a shared aim of weakening the United States and its leadership role in the world. At about the same time, the Commission on National Defense Strategy, run by two people I know well, Jane Harman, former member of Congress from California, was the chair of that congressionally appointed commission. Representative Harman introduced herself as the representative from Boeing. Boeing was a major employer in her district. She is very well thought of in the national security world. I got to know her when we served together on the Defense Policy Board for Secretary of Defense Gates. Speaking of Gates, in September of last year, Gates, the best Secretary of Defense we ever had in my eyes, worked pretty closely with him, says we face an aggressive China and Russia, abetted by North Korea and Iran, and the very real prospect of war between nuclear armed great powers. Thanks, Bob. That's cheery. Bob very much echoing what Jane and Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Eric Edelman, was Jane's co-chair on the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. That congressionally mandated report is open press. You can download it right now. You can read it sitting there. You should read it instead of listening to me. What Jane and Eric say in the 7-page executive summary of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy is that we face the most serious threats we've encountered since 1945, including the potential for near-term major war, and they say we are not prepared for those threats today. Bob Gates agrees. That's scary. Ann Applebaum is a student of autocracy. She is married to a Polish member of parliament. Her book, Autocracy Incorporated, The Dictators Who Want to Rule the World, came out a year ago. Heard her speak in Harrisburg. She's very, very good. She talks as well to things like the Russia-North Korea partnership that at the time put this slide together a year ago had not resulted in North Korean soldiers fighting and dying on the Ukrainian battlefield, but it obviously has since. And the Moscow-Beijing No Limits partnership. Wall Street Journal's smart people, Warren Strobel, Mike Gordon, how Putin rebuilt Russia's war machine with help from U.S. adversaries, and a terrific quote from NATO SecGen Jens Stoltenberg. China, North Korea, Iran propping up the Russian war in Ukraine. They want to see the U.S. fail. They want to see NATO fail. If they succeed in Ukraine, it will make us more vulnerable and the world more dangerous. A more recent quote from June of this year, Starmer, the Prime Minister of England, We face the most serious military threat since the Cold War. War in Europe, new nuclear risks, daily cyber attacks, and growing Russian aggression below the threshold of war, what we call gray area phenomena, irregular war activities from Russia ongoing now. And this quote, of course, before the incursions on NATO's eastern flank, which happened while I was at U.S. Army Europe headquarters in Wiesbaden, Germany, 2 weeks ago. And I just published a piece on that last week titled Dispatch from Wiesbaden that you can find if you're interested. Russia pretty clearly, to me, conducting probing attacks to see what NATO will do and whether they can knock Poland, I think, in particular, out of the war. Without Poland's support, I don't know that Ukraine is able to continue the war conventionally. During World War II, the United States supplied the weaponry that won the war. This is particularly true in ships. That's a Liberty ship being launched during the later phases of World War II. We were launching a Liberty ship every 24 hours. Today, China produces 60%, 60% of the shipbuilding in the world by tonnage. The United States produces 0.5, not 5%. 0.5%, one half of 1% of the shipbuilding in the world by tonnage is produced by the United States of America right now. We simply cannot compete in a protracted war with China. We don't have the shipbuilding capacity right now. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in May of 1940 went to the Congress and gave the talk Ominous Days. This was right about the time France was falling to Hitler. In that talk, he asked Congress for money to go from 6,000 planes a year, which we had built in the previous year, to 50,000 airplanes a year. In fact, over the next 5 years, that's what we produced, 250,000 airplanes, 250,000 airplanes over the course of the next 5 years. We provided American industrial might, provided the sinews of war on both fronts. Russia falls. Russia does not defeat Hitler. Russia comes to a separate peace with Hitler without American support. Britain probably falls without American Lend-Lease support. That's how important the American defense industrial base was. It simply isn't there today. We've managed to increase the production of 155 artillery rounds, but at enormous cost with enormous work. And those are the easy things to produce in bulk. The other stuff is harder, and we haven't even started on that. We have done some good in providing a bunch of support to Ukraine. This is a December 2024 slide because over 2025, we have provided next to no support directly to Ukraine. We've stopped. I believe that's a mistake. If all of these folks are right, people like Bob Gates, Phil Zelikow, Jane Harmon, Eric Edelman, George Will, Richard Fontaine, Andrea Kendall Taylor, Mike McCall. And World War III happens. It's likely to be a long war. To deter it, we have to be prepared to win it. As already noted, very smart people say we are not currently prepared to do it. Our defense industrial base is fragile and hollow. We can't even produce the low-end stuff, much less the high-end stuff. By the way, the high-end stuff largely requires rare earth elements. Those rare earth elements are not stockpiled in the United States and are almost exclusively produced in China. If we're at war with China, they obviously won't be providing us with rare earth minerals. And in fact, the trade war with China resulted in China turning off the shipment of rare earth minerals to the United States, causing howls from our defense and our aerospace and our high-tech computer and chip industries. Deeply concerning. Casualties very high. We've talked to that already. The picture on the slide was 50 years long enough, written by me and one of my former West Point students and then students here at the War College a couple of years ago, asked whether we need to resume the draft. Of note, leaked documents indicate that Germany is contemplating resuming the draft, increasing the size of its military by 50%, which is roughly what Edelman and Harmon in the Commission on National Defense Strategy, again, congressionally mandated, say we should do. They say we should go from $1 trillion a year on defense to 1.5 trillion, increasing the size of our military by about 50%. That would return the Army to about 750,000 active from the roughly 450,000 active we have today. That is the size of the Army I was commissioned in 1988, 37 years ago. You could make a very good argument that the world is more dangerous now than it was then. And of course, America is appreciably bigger now than it was then. We simply don't have enough army to do all the things we need to do to deter war in both Asia and Europe and the Middle East today. War is unpredictable and highly contingent. Putin thought he was going to take Kyiv in a week. His tank commanders were carrying dress uniforms on their tank for the parade in Kyiv during their initial invasion. I spent a bunch of time on tanks. There is no room in a tank for a dress uniform. The dress uniforms were occupying space that they should have filled with munitions and chow. They chose not to do so, and they were turned back, but it was a near run thing. We can't hope that Putin's going to be deposed, but whoever deposes him may well be worse. Happy to talk through what I think are some of the lessons President Xi of China is learning from the Ukraine war. We've got to learn from this war, but these are hard, expensive wars, and we are simply not prepared for them. Tim Snyder is, I think, one of the smartest, most pessimistic observers of the situation today. Tim says it's 1938. 1938 was, in my opinion, the last year that World War II could have been prevented. Instead, Neville Chamberlain surrendered the Czechs to the Nazis. That made the German military much more capable and harder to stop when war erupted. Tim suggests that this time the Ukrainians or the modern day Czechs are fighting back, and so far we have not thrown them overboard. Pretty obviously, I think we should not. When I give this talk to military audiences, as I did this morning, I close by saying, if in fact World War III is going to start next year, what should you be doing to prepare? I am fat, I am old, I am well past recall date to the United States Army. If war breaks out, I am likely to keep doing what I am doing right now, teaching officers, writing articles, talking to groups, doing media. Their jobs, their lives will change dramatically and forever. What should they be doing to prepare? Just recently, I've stopped calling this Project 1938 and started calling it Project 1939 because I have been thinking that it's too late and this war is inevitably going to happen. In literally the last 24 hours with what happened at the UN, that may no longer be the case. I am waiting to see what actions our NATO friends and our friends in Washington, the administration, choose to take that may well push the hands of the doomsday clock back.
Fantastic talk, John. Thank you very
Thank you, ma'am.
much. Okay, so question for you from online. How do we prepare for a future conflict when we have confusion and discord from our civilian leadership?
Yeah, that's actually the most important question. Kudos to whoever came up with that one first. I've been doing a bunch of study of the Second World War. The closest example we have to what worldwide war looks like, arguably the critical moment in World War II came when Neville Chamberlain's government fell and was replaced by Winston Churchill's in England. Hitler thought that Britain would sue for peace. They didn't quit. It was the British people who rescued the British Army from Dunkirk, and it was the British people who stood up during the Blitz, but they needed Churchill. They needed his leadership. The Commission on National Defense Strategy, the Harman-Edelman Commission, released its report in July of 2024, hoping that the spotlight of a presidential campaign would land on their report, that the questions they were posing, suggesting a 50% increase in the defense budget and the prospects of great power war on two fronts, would gain the attention of the American people and the attention of the candidates. In fact, as you may recall, July of 2024 saw instead the extraordinary decision by President Biden to drop out of the race, Kamala Harris's entry into the race, and that took all the oxygen from the room. And the Commission on National Strategy's report landed like a lead balloon, and we've not had that national discussion. And so people like me write articles and talk to folks, but we have not built the national consensus that World War III would be extraordinarily costly. It would hurt all of the countries involved. And deterrence, although it's expensive, is much cheaper than war.
Absolutely. And talking to our group, we have obviously a strong interest in national security here. I have a question for you from one of your students in Seminar 13. In light
Arr. We're the pirates. We're the pirates. So whenever you say Seminar 13, you have to say arr.
Okay, the
I don't make
pirates
the
of
rules. I don't make the rules. Yep.
Seminar. So in light of the announcement that the president made yesterday, where he mentioned specifically that Ukraine could conceivably win the war and take back its land, focusing on NATO collectively, and also taking advantage of the drone and cyber capabilities, as you mentioned, had been developed in the last year. What do you think we should anticipate? Are we looking at trying to really bog Russia down in a protracted war while we focus our energy and attention on China? And while we're doing that, what role will other countries, in particular India, be playing in this potential conflict?
I'm a big fan of Phillips Payson O'Brien, professor at St. Andrews. His book, How the War Was Won, is one of the most interesting reanalyses of World War II. It's shaped my thinking heavily. I think he goes too far when he says that it was the air power and naval power that won World War II, but I have great respect for his focus on defense industry and defense industrial base producing the sinews of war. That thinking has heavily shaped my own thinking. He does a terrific analysis of the combined bomber offensive against Nazi Germany and notes what a critical mistake it was focusing on ball bearings because ball bearings don't burn. And if you hit the ball bearing plant, it's just steel. It doesn't burn. He suggests that we would have been far better off targeting German oil supplies, coal gasification plants, that it's a softer target, it's an easier target, it burns, you don't have to hit it directly, and it's a much more vulnerable target. It appears to me that my friends in Ukraine have read O'Brien's book because their strategic bombing campaign, conducted almost exclusively with drones, has been targeting Russian oil refineries and petroleum distribution networks. And those things burn. And Ukraine has been conducting just recently repeated attacks against them. O'Brien writes a Substack on the war. He suggests that the long range attacks on Russian petroleum capacity are having an outsized effect on Russia's ability to continue the war. Russia has been described by geopoliticians as a gas station with nuclear weapons. If we can knock out their petroleum refining capacity, if Ukraine can do that, perhaps with intelligence and targeting support from some of its friends, that may be the strategic center of gravity of Russia. The president, in his Truth Social post announcing a change in his policy toward the Russo-Ukrainian war, called out the lines at Russian gasoline stations. And O'Brien has been suggesting that there's a change in the analysis by the American intelligence community. He suggests that the tone is changing based on the newspaper reports, that increasingly American observers believe that Ukraine is having strategic effect on Russia through its attacks on petroleum. That ended up having an outsized effect on Germany's ability to conduct its war in World War II, and observers believe that that may be what's happening now. That may, at least in part, have driven President Trump's turnabout on U.S. policy toward Ukraine. The big question now is he going to follow it up with weapons shipments directly from America? And I want to highlight that a lot of the stuff that was shipped to Ukraine under the Biden drawdown, but a lot of the weapons we were giving them had reached their sell-by date. And it was actually cheaper for us to ship the stuff to Ukraine for them to use it against Russia than it would have been for us to blow it up in an environmentally safe manner here in the United States. It was cheaper for us to give it to Ukraine than for us to blow it up ourselves. And the Ukrainians were completely good with missiles past their sell-by date. We wouldn't have used them, American forces, but the Ukrainians were willing to take that risk. Maureen mentioned that it absolutely makes sense for us to continue the war in Ukraine. Russia is learning a lot of lessons, but it is also costing Russia a great deal. I believe that as long as Ukraine stands and fights conventionally, again, that's going to take NATO support, US support, as long as that continues, that dramatically decreases Russia's ability to broaden the war. The numbers we heard in Wiesbaden 2 weeks ago at US Army Europe were order of magnitude 200 Russian brigades fighting in Ukraine, perhaps 100 Ukrainian brigades fighting in Ukraine. All of NATO can bring about 85 brigades. Again, this is press accounts, UNCLOS stuff. And NATO is building to over the next 3, 4, 5 years to 135 brigades able to defend what's called the Eastern Flank Deterrence Line. You should all know those words, the Eastern Flank Deterrence Line. And I believe you will be seeing lots of writing and thinking, some of it by me on EFDL. We want the Russians to know, my analysis, I don't know this for a fact, we're being very open about our plan. This is General Chris Donahue, the new U.S. Army Europe commander's big idea. It appears to me that he wants Russia to know that U.S. Army Europe, NATO as a whole, is returning to a warfighting posture in order to deter aggression.
Excellent. Thank you, John. This is a quick question that probably doesn't have an easy answer. How do we pay for World War III? And how do we do that given the current state of the U.S. economy?
Yeah, the current state of the U.S. economy is actually pretty good. It's not perfect by any means. It's not sunshine and flowers. But I'm going to remind this audience of some facts they're not going to like to hear. That noted communist Dwight D. Eisenhower, you may have heard of him. When Eisenhower was president, the top marginal tax rate in the United States was 90%, 90%, 90%. Eisenhower, communist, 90%. Right? Top marginal rate in the United States right now is in the 30s. Can we afford higher tax rates to prevent World War III? I've got a 21-year-old son. I'm willing to pay a higher tax rate to keep World War III from happening. Europe is currently stepping up, at least in declaratory policy. So a year ago, Europe was struggling to reach 2% gross domestic product on defense. They have now, under President Trump's urging, highlighted as well by the threat they feel. It's fascinating. We have students from 75 different countries attending the Army War College. It is fascinating to talk to them about what they see as the Russian threat. When I was in Wiesbaden 2 weeks ago at U.S. Army Europe, the Polish officer assigned to the U.S. Army Europe headquarters was there, and he was white on the day after the Russian incursion by drones into Polish airspace. But President Macron of France, who has agreed to that 5% of GDP spending on defense, his government just fell. He was unable to get a new prime minister elected. The prime minister was running on fewer holidays and higher taxes to pay for increased French defense spending. Are we going to spend more money? Are we going to raise taxes in order to try to deter the world war? Or are we not going to do that? And are we going to fight that war and then raise taxes anyway, a whole lot higher than we would have, but we're also going to pay with the blood of our children? A year ago, I was at U.S. Army Pacific doing some work, and as part of that, I got to spend a Sunday morning at a place called Pearl Harbor. I don't know how many of the folks in the room have been to Pearl. We had a rudimentary radar system set up on the north shore of Oahu, facing north. That's where we thought the attack would come from. If it came, we thought it would come on a Saturday or a Sunday morning. And of course it did on that fateful day, December 7th, 1941. The radar operators, two of them, picked it up, said it was the biggest radar intercept they'd ever seen. They called some poor Army captain, who was the duty officer that Sunday morning, and he told them that it was just B-17s we were ferrying in from California, not to worry about it. He didn't call the Navy, and we weren't ready. And worst day for the American military, I would argue, in our history. Are we more ready now? We are. Do we have everything we need? We do not. Are the chances for war real? Very, very, very real. This is the conversation I believe we should be having as a nation. Obviously, we're having other conversations.
You mentioned the stunning statistic at the very beginning that China is producing 60% of the world's shipbuilding capability, and we have 0.5. What role do warships play in a war that is now transitioned to heavily being fought with drones and cyber? Are not warships sitting ducks in World War III? And do we really need to have them as part of our arsenal looking forward?
That's a terrific question. Perhaps the greatest accomplishment of Ukraine, a country that sort of literally doesn't have a navy. It has defeated the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian military. I met with General Kurt Buzzard, and General Buzzard has in his office in Wiesbaden a model of the Black Sea, which includes a number of models of Russian ships on the bottom of the Black Sea given to him by a Ukrainian friend of his who has played a role in sinking Russian ships through the creation of unmanned underwater and unmanned on-water vehicles. The sea war is secondary in Ukraine and in Europe. Europe is primarily an Army Air Force theater. The sea battle is primary in a war with China. China currently has the biggest navy in the world, bigger than the United States Navy. It also, just in the past week, has been demonstrating the capabilities of its new flat deck carrier. So it has two ski jump carriers with a turned up nose with a ramp at the end that limits the effectiveness of carrier. It limits how much payload, both in fuel and in munitions, that you can carry when you're launching off of a carrier. But they now have a straight deck carrier with a catapult for the first time. And within the next year or two, they plan to launch their first nuclear powered carrier. I'm less concerned about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan that would look like D-Day, than I am a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, which would force us, the United States, to fire the first shots. We'd have to decide we were going to break the blockade with a big enough surface navy that could keep us far enough away that it would be almost impossible for us to break a near blockade of Taiwan, and Taiwan couldn't hold out very long. It would be like Britain in World War II. If the Germans had won the Battle of the Atlantic, it would literally starve to death. Do we need more ships? We need a lot more ships. In particular, we need more Virginia-class attack submarines. My dad was a submariner. I was born on a sub base, and one of the great events of my life, I got to go underway aboard a Virginia-class boat, the USS Mississippi, for a couple of days. We don't have enough attack boats. We can't build them fast enough. We're trying to build some now for Australia. I think that's great, but we don't have enough welders. And it takes 10 years to build a welder for submarines, the same way it takes 10 years to build a major or a sergeant first class. You can turn majors into generals. You can turn sergeants first class into command sergeants major or lieutenants. But that first 10 years is absolutely essential. You can't build a welder fast enough. And you may have seen the Super Bowl. The U.S. Navy was broadcasting advertisements for welders. We need a lot more ships.
You mentioned in passing Iran. What is your response to the Israeli US attack on Iran? And is that contributing to or detracting from our ability to really counter the axis of upheaval, which I think is a great phrase?
This is the sort of the one bright light we've got. Iran has passed on the ability to produce Shahed drones to Russia, and Russia is building its own Shaheeds. But Iran has, other than that, largely speaking, been taken off the table by Israel and the United States as an actor with initiative. Iran was hiding behind its proxy forces, in particular Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been decimated by covert Israeli attacks, in particular the pagers, and the strike on its nuclear capabilities has set those back as well. We had the Iranian president yesterday at the UN stating that he has no interest in producing nuclear weapons. I don't know if I believe that or not, but I know his capability to do it has been severely limited. A bunch of lessons here for modern warfare. During the last 20 years of irregular war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we downsized a bunch of our air defense capabilities. We didn't have an air threat in Iraq or Afghanistan. We demobilized a lot of our engineer capabilities because we were working in fixed bases. We didn't need to breach minefields, build bridges, those sorts of things. Now we're rebuilding those capabilities, but the failures of Iranian air defenses. Iran is essentially wide open and exposed anytime Israel, anytime the United States wants to attack them, they can. Let me put a little more sugar in this bitter pill. Those were Russian-made air defense systems that Israel dismantled from the air. My Air Force friends tell me that Russian air defenses, while formidable for Ukraine, will be much less formidable for the United States, and that we will have air superiority in any fight with Russia. They do not say the same thing about China. China has the advantage of interior lines. It's a home fight for China. It's an away fight for us. And they believe that China would have at least local air superiority in any fight in the Philippine Sea. So we would have to work very hard to create episodes using space capabilities, cyber capabilities, air, naval, and ground capabilities to create windows of opportunity when we could achieve local fleeting air superiority to do certain things to the Chinese. The focus of some of the courses I teach here at the War College are in opening those windows, doing what we call multi-domain operations, figuring out when it makes sense to do that, how to do it, and against what targets.
This morning, Tom Friedman put out an article where he talked about the fact that the Ukrainians are actually recoding their drones on the fly in the field to respond to Russian countermeasures. Is that a capability from the War College's perspective? Do we have that kind of capability to give our forces? Are we building those skills and giving them the authorization to operate at that kind of a level?
The Ukrainians are the best in the world at drone warfare, and our defense production timelines do not support that kind of innovation. So the purpose of the work I'm doing in studying Ukraine at the Army War College is to see what lessons we should be learning, and a ton of them are in this defense industrial base, drone production, drone employment, the creation of specialized drone units, something that the United States Army is just now considering. The Army is run by General Randy George, who I've literally known for 40 years. Randy and I were West Point classmates. I was in Company D1, Delta 1. He was in Company Echo 1. I've known Randy, now General George, for a long, long time. I don't envy him the challenges he faces because, as I previously mentioned, he's having to stand up air defense capabilities. He's having to stand up engineer capabilities, and his end strength is not getting any bigger. This is why I highlight so strongly the work of Edelman and Harmon and the Commission on National Defense Strategy, who say that we don't have a big enough military right now. Randy George shouldn't have to be choosing between standing up air defense units, engineer units, and building new drone units. He should be able to do all three of those at once. And right now, he doesn't have enough lemons to make all of the lemonade that he needs to make. That includes absolutely drone units. Now, we are doing experimentation. The folks I talked to in Europe this morning are standing up some specialized drone units, but we're a couple of years behind where the Ukrainians are. And the Ukrainians have been very generous. They would love to have American soldiers on the ground in those drone units. That's a decision we've chosen not to do. But they have issued an invitation at this Land Euro conference I talked about, which was attended very heavily by American, European defense companies. They invited them to bring their systems to Ukraine and test them on the battlefield in combat against Russian forces. Whether that is actually happening or not, I can't say. And if I could say, I wouldn't say. But there's a whole ton of work to be done. This is why I think we get the interest we do when we publish as a result of the study we're doing here at the War College, all unclassified, all paid for by you, the taxpayer, all available to you online. You can read this stuff. The Ukrainians are not just, in my eyes, defending freedom on NATO's eastern flank, but they are also learning lessons about warfare that will save American lives, and they are very, very willing to share them with us.
Excellent. Thank you. What role do nuclear weapons play? Are we going to continue to allow Russians' nuclear saber rattling to deter us from more aggressive actions in Ukraine? But then you've got China building a nuclear arsenal. You've got obviously the attacks on Iran that were a result of that. With our nuclear weapons in World War III?
First, I am a fan of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are one of the two reasons, along with the United States Department of Defense, now Department of War, and our allies and partners around the globe, that the incidence of great power war has diminished so greatly in the past 80 years since World War II. In the first 50 years of the 20th century, we fought the two greatest wars in world history. World War I killed 20 million. The Great Spanish Influenza killed 20 million as a direct result of World War I. And then World War II killed 50 million. We had every expectation that we would continue to have a world war, a global war, every generation. And it hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened because of the United States Department of Defense, Department of State, Agency for International Development, and because of nuclear weapons. Steven Pinker wrote a terrific book called The Better Angels of Our Nature that looks at the decline in deaths in war. And the result is dramatic. War has certainly not gone away, but wars are infinitely less destructive than they have been. And so nuclear deterrence is, in my eyes, a good thing. That said, it's not absolute. Certainly the Ukrainians would agree. The Ukrainians would like nothing so much right now as to have the nuclear weapons they gave up. They had, I think, the third or fourth largest nuclear stockpile in the world when the Soviet Union collapsed. They gave those up in return for security guarantees that have not been honored. There's a lesson there for other states. And so I'm deeply concerned about proliferation of nuclear weapons. One of the great successes of American foreign policy in the nuclear era, John F. Kennedy thought that there would be 25 nuclear powers by the year 2000. Instead, there were 9. That's huge because although nuclear weapons minimize the chances for big wars, every nuclear weapon is a risk of an accidental discharge. There's a number of different risks involved. All that said, nuclear weapons are becoming a bigger part of U.S. military strategy. This is all on class. We have increased our nuclear weapons study at the Army War College. We have increased our nuclear warfighting studies at the Army War College. That's true across the entire Department of Defense. The question of Russia's ability to deter with nuclear weapons and whether that has influenced U.S. policy, the answer to that is clearly yes. The Biden administration was very clear about that. And in fact, the New York Times reported that in the fall of 22, as the war in Ukraine had turned dramatically in Ukraine's favor, and Ukraine was rapidly regaining territory, and it looked as if the Ukrainian counteroffensive might extend all the way into Russian territory, that the New York Times reported that at the highest levels in the Kremlin, that Putin was discussing the use of tactical nuclear weapons to blunt the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so, should we be concerned about Russian nuclear capabilities? Absolutely. Should NATO, as it plans the eastern flank defense line, plan to strike Moscow as part of a defense of the Balts? We should have those plans, but I think we should be able to stop a Russian offensive without relying on nuclear weapons. NATO countries have, what, 5 times the population, 10 times the population of Russia, 10 times the GDP. We should be able to stop it without nuclear weapons, but we have to be cognizant of Russian nuclear capabilities. We also have to be deeply concerned about Chinese nuclear capabilities. A terrific book by an old friend of mine, Jim Stavridis, retired Navy admiral, only admiral to be the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Book is 2034. In that book, which I commend to all of you, it's a terrific beach read if you're sort of weird. There is a nuclear exchange and a war between China and the United States in which Houston ceases to exist. You don't like paying more for taxes. Imagine what losing Houston will do to gas prices in the United States. Right? We'd be better off keeping Houston. We'd be better off spending more to deter that.
So you said, is it 1938 globally? Lots of people have talked about it domestically looking more like 1968. So from your perspective in the War College, how do we get to 2028 and not be in World War III?
I think President Trump took some big steps in that direction yesterday at the UN. I think that there is more we can do to partner with Ukraine to provide them with the capabilities they need to defend themselves. And there's a nice place to close, tying the two fronts together. I think President Xi regrets his no limits partnership with Moscow, which he announced the month before the invasion. He clearly knew that Putin was going to invade Ukraine at that point. He thought that Ukraine would fall. Ukraine hasn't fallen. And Ukraine's resilience, Ukraine's determination, Ukraine's courage has sent a message to Russia, obviously, but also a message to Taiwan and a message to President Xi. The free people of the world, there are more of us. The free countries of the world have the ability to deter this war, and if this war happens, to win it. The question right now is whether we have the will as free peoples around the globe and whether our political leadership is going to pull us together to prevent this horrific calamity from happening. I hope it does. I believe the discussions like the one we've had today and the discussions I hope that will ensue that follow with you, all of you in the room, you online, and your friends will further contribute to that shared determination not to allow this to happen again.
Fantastic. And stay tuned. We look forward to having you at our next program. Take care and have a great day and be safe. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you all.